It is sometimes the smallest noises that trouble one the most. A cough echoing down a cloister, the faint scrape of chalk on slate, or, as it was that evening, the whisper of pages being turned in the Radcliffe camera, a sound so gentle that one might mistake it for the shifting of autumn leaves outside. Yet it was enough to disturb me, perhaps because I knew the library was almost empty, perhaps because silence, in Oxford, is seldom what it seems. I had not meant to linger there. A crossword left unsolved in the afternoon, an itch of a clue gnawing at the back of my mind, had drawn me to the circular sanctum after dinner. The clue itself was nothing remarkable, 7 letters, definition hidden, somewhere between elegy and deceit, but it was unfinished business, and I dislike those more than most things. I took a chair beneath the high dome and tried to force language into obedience, all the while listening to the steady fall of rain against the ancient glass. The pages turned again. Someone in the far alcove. I could not see them, only the outline of the lamplight broken now and then by the flicker of movement. The guardians of the camera lock its doors at 10. This was close to 9:30. It seemed late for a reader to be so absorbed. Students have their vigils, of course, yet there was an air-call-it instinct that suggested something different. I rose, stretched, pretended to examine a shelf of Johnson's Lives, and caught the tail of a shadow disappearing deeper into the alcove. It might have ended there, had not my eyes strayed to the return trolley. A single volume rested upon it, a thin octavo bound in blue cloth, the title embossed in fading gilt, The Theology of Candlelight. I had never heard of it. It was unmarked, save for a curious smudge across the lower spine, as if a finger had pressed too long into damp ink. I noted it, idly at first, then more keenly. The smudge resembled a half-print, incomplete, like an unfinished word. Something about it nagged me. Lewis would later ask me why I noticed it at all. I could not answer. One observes, that is all. By the time I looked again toward the alcove, the shadow had gone. Chairs sat neatly tucked beneath their desks, lamps extinguished. Yet I was certain of a presence, as one is certain of a drought, though the windows remain closed. I did not pursue it. I am not, despite what some imagine, a man for the melodramatic chase. Instead, I returned to my crossword. The clue resolved itself suddenly. Palinode, of course, a poem that retracts what was said before. Retract, recant, take back. A word about falsity disguised as repentance. That, too, stayed with me. The rain thickened. The porter's bell rang distantly for closing. I replaced the pen in my pocket and, with reluctance, left the dome behind. As I stepped out into the quadrangle, the lamps pooled their amber light onto slick flagstones, and the smell of wet stone rose like something older than thought. I hesitated at the gate, glanced back once more at the darkening windows. A trivial detail, the mark on the spine, the unseen reader at my mind, obstinate as ever, refused to let it be trivial. I told myself it was nothing, a solitary student, a forgotten book. And yet even then I knew, though I would not admit it, that the whisper of those pages was not the beginning of an essay, but of a death. And the clue, solved too late, had already spoken. News rarely arrives in the manner one expects. Some come folded neatly in envelopes, some whispered down corridors, some scrawled carelessly on blackboards. That morning it came in the brusque shuffle of Lewis at my door, his raincoat dripping across the worn carpet, his eyes carrying the unpolished urgency of bad tidings. He said little, but enough. A body had been found in the upper gallery of Bodleian Library, and the porter had insisted I should see it before the coroner's men arrived. I confess I resented the summons, not because death unsettled someone grows too accustomed to it, but because it had trespassed into the sanctuary of the books, where the smell of paper and ink ought to hold dominion over any darker scent. Still I went. We walked quickly across Radcliffe Square, our shoes striking against the stones in a rhythm that seemed too loud for the hour. The rain had left the pavements glossy, as though the city had been polished overnight for some unwelcome ceremony. The porter was waiting, pale as parchment, his cap pulled low as if ashamed. He muttered of locked doors, of the impossibility of intrusion, of how he had found the figure slumped over the reading desk with a lamp still burning beside her elbow. Her. A woman, then. I noted his pronoun, though he had not yet given me her name. Lewis asked me. Dr. Amelia Greaves, a fellow in theology, recently cataloguing a series of obscure manuscripts. I recalled the blue octavo I had seen the previous night, its spine blemished, and felt the faint tightening that comes when disparate threads begin, almost against one's will, to align. The gallery was still, its silence more oppressive than any chapel's. There she lay, her head bowed as if in sudden prayer, one hand resting upon the opened folio before her. The lamp hummed faintly. The folio was an illuminated sermon, its margins crowded with notes in a cramped, elegant hand. Her other hand dangled uselessly, a ring glinting in the faint light. A heavy signet, too large, I thought, for her thin finger. A gift, perhaps, or a relic borrowed. Lewis shifted behind me, his discomfort audible in the creak of the floorboards. The coroner would later declare a sudden failure of the heart. A tidy verdict, convenient, acceptable. Yet I could not help but look at the scene and see untidiness everywhere, the glass of water half drunk but without condensation, the chair slightly skewed from the desk as though someone else had drawn it back, and the folio itself, page 147 open, though the preceding margin bore the denser annotations. Why that page? Why that blankness? Lewis asked if I thought it was suicide. I shook my head, though no one but he could see the gesture. There was no note, no hint of finality in her expression. Her face was almost peaceful, but not resigned. She had been interrupted, that much was clear, interrupted in study, in life, and I could not ignore the coincidence. The sound of pages turned last night, the vanishing shadow, the unfamiliar book with its curious stain. Accidents occur, yes. But Oxford has a way of arranging its accidents into patterns that defy chance. The porter whispered something about her brilliance, how she was often the last to leave, how she carried her own keys. A scholar of forgotten texts, he said, one who believed the margins of books could conceal truths never meant to surface. I heard him, but my eyes lingered on the ring, a crest faintly inscribed, a bird, wings outstretched, the kind of emblem one might find on old college seals or in heraldic registers. I made a note to myself, silent, inward, of the need to consult those records, not for the grandeur of history, but for the way it leaves fingerprints. The men came with their stretcher, their canvas, their cold efficiency. I let them pass, unwilling to intrude further upon her stillness. Outside, the rain had softened into mist, and the gargoyles of the Sheldonian seemed to watch with grim satisfaction. Lewis lit a cigarette, though he rarely smoked, and said he pitied the students who would read in that gallery henceforth. I said nothing. My mind was elsewhere, circling the word I had solved the night before, palinode. A retraction, a taking back. And I wondered, not without unease, what exactly Amelia Greaves had been preparing to retract when death found her at her desk. The college common room has always struck me as a place of rehearsed conviviality. Books line the walls, of course, but few are ever touched. The sherry is decanted with a flourish, the port with more reverence than the Eucharist, and the conversation meanders from politics to publishing with the air of men and women who like to be overheard. That night I entered as an intruder, though Lewis trailed behind with the ease of someone who has not yet learned to resent these rooms. They knew why I had come. News of Amelia Greaves's death had spread faster than the mist across Christchurch Meadow, and already the scholars were forming their polite barricades of sorrow. A young man in a corduroy jacket was speaking of her brilliance, her devotion to the manuscripts, her refusal to compromise. An older Don muttered about the tragedy of overwork, how the mind collapses when pressed too hard against its own enthusiasms. I listened, saying nothing, letting their words knot themselves into the tapestry of half-truths that so often draped the dead. I asked when she had last been seen. A pause followed, too deliberate to be innocent. A woman at the corner, her gown unbuttoned at the throat, admitted she had passed Amelia in the quad around 8, rain dripping from her umbrella as though the night itself had tried to weigh her down. She remembered that Amelia had smiled, but not easily. She said she had books under her arm and perhaps a letter, though she could not be certain. Perhaps. That word is always the scholar's refuge. Lewis, with his plain kindness, asked whether Amelia had enemies. They laughed at that uncomfortable laugh, the kind that masks rather than denies. One of them murmured that her research was controversial, that she had been challenging accepted views of apocryphal texts, and that some colleagues found her abrasive. The word hung there, sour as spoiled wine. I noted who had said it, though I will not say his name even now. There was no kindness in his eyes, only a satisfaction too quickly concealed. The fire crackled, and I found myself staring at the brass poker. A crosspiece shaped like a bird with spread wings. The echo of the signet rings upon her hand, too neat to ignore, too coincidental to dismiss. I filed it away as one files a crossword solution that does not yet intersect with the others, but will, inevitably, later. They began to speak of her scholarship, how she had argued that certain annotations in the Bodleian margins were not the idle doodlings of medieval scribes, but deliberate cyphers warnings, perhaps, or confessions disguised as piety. It was the kind of theory that half the room derided and the other half envied, and I thought of her head upon that folio, her life ended mid-sentence, as though the text itself had claimed her. Yet I did not say so. One must ration one's melancholy. Lewis nudged me gently. He had seen the way my gaze had returned, again and again, to the woman who spoke of the letter. So I asked, was it sealed? Was it addressed? She could not say. She had not looked closely. But she always thought that Amelia had slipped it inside one of the volumes she carried, and none of those volumes had been found at her desk. Silence followed, the kind that tastes of stone corridors and unopened doors. I took my leave with no more grace than I had entered. The quadrangle outside was black with rain, the lamplight thin, the gargoyles gazing down as though amused at our fumbling inquiries. Lewis asked, as we walked beneath the archway, whether I believed the scholars. I told him the belief was for sermons, not for men like us. We dealt in shadows, and shadows, unlike scholars, seldom lied. There are certain rooms in Oxford where the air itself seems to withhold trust. The manuscript room of the Bodleian is one of them. The glass cases gleam, the lights hum with a librarian's precision, and every book is shackled to its duty by catalogues and codes. Yet I have always felt those folios are less guardians of truth than conspirators against it. It was there, among the folios, that I sought whatever remnant of Amelia Greaves's final work might have survived her silence. Lewis was uneasy. He never cared for the stillness of such places where even a cough earns disapproval. He asked whether I truly expected to find something in the very book that had been open on her desk when she died. I told him I did not expect, only hoped. Expectation has disappointed me too often. The folio was brought to us in ritual silence. Gloves offered, rules murmured. I bent over the pages as one bent over a confession. The sermon text was plain enough, Latin arranged in neat, pious columns. Yet the margins drew my eye. Amelia's hand was unmistakably angular, pressed hard into the paper as if the ink itself resisted her urgency. I traced the scrawl, a sequence of words that seemed less annotation than argument. Beneath a passage on the virtue of obedience, she had written, simply, retracted, the same word that had haunted me since the crossword clue resolved itself days before. Coincidence, perhaps. Yet I have never been fond of coincidences. Lewis leaned close, frowning at the cramped letters. He asked what it meant. I said it might mean nothing, but I did not believe that. The marginalia was too deliberate, the letters etched like scars, and on the very next page a blank margin, no note at all, an absence that shouted louder than presence. Why had she written with such vehemence, only to stop, unless she had been interrupted? The custodian, a thin man with spectacles that slid constantly down his nose, muttered that Amelia had requested the folio 3 nights in a row, each time staying later than the rules allowed. She told him she was close to discovering something, though she gave no detail. He had thought her eccentric, perhaps obsessed. He said this with a faint smile, as if obsession were merely another quirk of scholarship. I heard him, but my mind was fixed on the word retract, the ink darker than its neighbours, the pen having pressed harder, deeper, almost to tearing. I turned the pages slowly. There was, at the binding, a faint misalignment, the paper bulging slightly, as though something had once been inserted there. No note remained, nothing but the memory of absence. Lewis did not see it, or if he did, he said nothing, but I noted it as surely as I would note a slip of the tongue in a suspect's alibi. When we returned the folio, Lewis asked whether Amelia had lied in her scholarship. He said it gently, almost apologetically, as if reluctant to tarnish her. I told him scholars do not always lie by invention, sometimes they lie by omission. And perhaps that is worse, because omission is harder to trace. He looked puzzled. I did not elaborate. As we left, the custodian called after us that Dr. Greaves had been working on a paper she never submitted. The title, he remembered dimly, involved the phrase lux obscura dark light. I said nothing, though I felt the phrase coil itself into the fabric of the case. Dark light, truth concealed by the very illumination that ought to reveal it. Outside, the quadrangle was slick with rain. Students hurried past, collars turned up, their laughter strangely fragile in the damp night. I thought of Amelia, head bowed over the folio, her hand tracing margins that might never have been meant to speak, the folio that lies by silence, by smudged ink, by the empty place where a letter had once been. And I wondered, as I often do, whether it is the living or the dead who lie best. It is a curious truth that Oxford does not weep easily. Death may stalk the cloisters, yet the common remedy is wine, poured liberally into the crystal of formality until memory itself begins to blur. That evening I accepted an invitation to a high table at one of the smaller colleges, not out of courtesy, but because Lewis persuaded me that scholars often reveal more between sips than in sworn testimony. He was right, though neither of us left the hall comforted. The dining hall glowed with a dull reverence, candles dripping wax onto silver, portraits gazing down with that peculiar mixture of disdain and boredom. The dons had gathered, their voices a low thunder rolling across Latin mottos carved into oak. I sat between a woman whose perfume was stronger than her conversation, and a man whose reputation in Elizabethan poetry outweighed his regard for the living. Lewis was further down the table, his fork moving in awkward sympathy with men who discussed politics of a sort he would never feign to understand. It was the wine that loosened them, a generous burgundy, heavy, blood-dark, that seemed to insist on confessions. They spoke of Amelia Greaves with the measured tone of those who wish to appear pained but not implicated. A fellow with thinning hair muttered that she had been too ambitious, that she sought publication beyond her station. Another corrected him with that Oxfordian cruelty which smiles while it wounds. She had not sought publication, but revelation. She believed words themselves carried a hidden pulse, a dangerous notion if you think too much about it. I let them talk, my glass barely touched. When I asked about her circle, the woman beside me raised an eyebrow. She had few friends, she said, though men often sought her company. Not for her charm, which was fleeting, but for her wit, which was not. The dons laughed briefly, then hid the laughter in their cups. It is always the same death that turns companions into critics, and critics into philosophers. None, however, become honest. Lewis caught my eye across the hall. He had noticed something. Later he told me of the young lecturer at his elbow who, after a second glass, admitted that Amelia had quarrelled with a senior fellow over the use of certain manuscripts. The quarrel was quiet but sharp, and she had left the common room with words still unspoken. He could not recall which fellow. Perhaps he would remember in the morning. Perhaps. After the meal, the men drifted toward the senior common room, the women too, though with less ease. The clink of glasses and the hush of curtains thickened the air. Conversation turned from scholarship to gossip, from words to women. I listened, and in listening began to note the absences more than the presences. One name was never spoken. The man with the thinning hair, who had muttered of ambition, never once acknowledged that Amelia had borrowed from his own research. Yet the custodian's record showed she had requested his manuscripts more than once. A silence too careful, too rehearsed? Silence, after all, is the most eloquent lie. I excused myself sooner than courtesy demanded. The air had become cloying, the words blurred by wine, and I felt that peculiar sadness that comes when truth is buried beneath laughter. Lewis followed, grateful for release. On the walk back across the quad, he asked whether I thought Amelia had been loved. I said I did not know, but that she had certainly been read. He frowned at this, not quite understanding. But books, I have long believed, are less forgiving than people. They remember every hand that turns their pages. In my room I poured myself a whiskey, not wine. The crossword lay folded where I had left it, the clue waiting. 5 letters deceit. The answer, when it came, was plain enough. Guile. A word as old as Homer, yet still fresh upon the tongues of dons and lovers alike. I wrote it slowly, each letter darker than the last, and thought of Amelia, surrounded by scholars, yet alone with her margins, where words spoke truths no wine could wash away. The difficulty with red herrings is not that they deceive, but that they comfort. They allow the mind to settle, to imagine a conclusion that fits neatly into expectation. And in Oxford, a city that thrives on illusion stone masquerading as permanence, ritual masquerading as meaning, comfort is the most seductive lie of all. The morning after the high table, Lewis and I were called to examine a letter. It had surfaced in the post-room, discovered beneath a stack of journals addressed to dons abroad. The envelope bore Amelia Greaves's name in her own hand, yet the seal was broken. The porter insisted it had been tampered with. He said he had found it already opened, the pages folded oddly, as though someone had read them in haste and then restored them carelessly. The letter itself was unremarkable, a note to the librarian requesting an extension for a manuscript loan. Nothing more. Yet the dons seized upon it as proof of her intentions. She had not meant to die, they said. She had meant to continue her work. A tidy explanation, one that permitted grief without suspicion. I turned the paper in my hand. The ink was consistent, the signature correct. But there was one phrase that caught me. She wrote, "In pursuit of clarity, I beg indulgence." Clarity. Not accuracy, not detail, but clarity. The word jarred against the measured tone of the rest. It was the kind of word a scholar avoids when precision is her trade. I said nothing then, but the unease remained. Lewis suggested perhaps she had been interrupted while writing. He reminded me with a trace of defensiveness that grief can unsettle syntax as well as sense. I agreed, though inwardly I did not. It was too neat, too much like the clue in a crossword that presents itself too readily, hiding the trap beneath. That day I walked the cloisters alone. The rain had thinned into drizzle, leaving the flagstones slick, reflecting arches as though the college itself was staring at its own distorted face. Students hurried by, their voices rising in the damp air. I paused by the chapel door, listening to the faint strains of rehearsal psalms broken off midway, as if the choir were chasing notes that refused to be caught. I thought again of Amelia, her head bent over the folio, her hand pressing into the margins with urgency. A woman who wrote with precision would not ask indulgence for clarity, unless she had not written it. That evening, I met Lewis in the library annex. He had been tracing her borrowings, checking the slips and ledgers that catalogued every book she touched. He showed me the record with pride, her name scrawled repeatedly, beside the same shelf mark, the same series of texts, except one slip was missing. He said it must have been misfiled. I asked him whether it had ever been there at all. He looked at me strangely as though I had accused him of something, but absence, I reminded him, can be as deliberate as presence. The librarian interrupted, his voice carrying the fatigue of one who has been questioned too often. He insisted Amelia had been troubled, that she had confided in him about pressures from her department. He offered this as explanation enough, his eyes eager for me to accept it. I watched his hands as he spoke. They trembled slightly, though not with age. With something else, a man protecting his own peace. Lewis later said perhaps that was all it was, a colleague's kindness, a scholar's overwork, a life ended by chance. He wanted the comfort of that. I could not grant it, for even then I could see the letter for what it was, not a truth, but a diversion. A fish dragged across the path to distract the hounds, and I wondered, not without bitterness, whether I too was among the hounds, nose bent to the wrong scent, while the real quarry slipped silently away. That night, back in my room, I returned to the crossword. 4 across false clues, 7 letters. The answer was obvious: decoy. I filled it in with a heaviness that no wine could soften, and thought how easily we accept the wrong words, so long as they ease the ache of doubt. The letter arrived in my hand not as discovery but as confession. Folded carelessly, the paper bore the faint bruise of words pressed too hard, as though the writer had hesitated between anger and restraint. Lewis placed it before me without ceremony, his eyes searching mine for something he could not name. He said it had been found tucked inside a volume on patristic sermons, a book Amelia had borrowed weeks before. The librarians insisted it had not been there when they checked. Yet there it was, as though time itself had carried it into the present, to mock us. The letter was unfinished, half a page of text, then silence. The salutation was formal, "Dear Sir But," no name followed. The sentences wound themselves into an argument half-spoken, accusing, questioning, circling something too dangerous to say outright. I read the lines again and again until the ink seemed to tremble beneath my gaze. She wrote of betrayal, of manuscripts withheld, of truth concealed in margins that others preferred to remain invisible. Then, abruptly, the pen trailed off, the words incomplete. It was not merely abandonment of thought, it was interruption. Lewis muttered that perhaps she had grown tired or distracted. He wanted an explanation where none was sufficient. I told him the absence spoke louder than completion. A scholar finishes her argument, even in draft. What she does not finish is what she dares not or cannot. I carried the letter to the window. The quad below was slick with rain, students drifting across like figures blurred in old glass. The sound of the chapel bell crept through the pane, 12 strokes falling with the slow weight of inevitability. I turned the paper once more, noting the indentation on the verso, the ghost of a word not visible in ink, only in pressure. I tilted it beneath the light, and the outline formed lux. Light. The same word the custodian had recalled from her unwritten paper, lux obscura. The light darkened, or perhaps light concealing. When I showed Lewis, he shrugged. A coincidence, he said. Scholars repeat themselves. They chase the same words like cats after shadows. I smiled at that, not because he was wrong, but because he was right, without knowing the depth of it. Words, like shadows, are never chased without reason. Later that night, I walked the corridors of the library alone. The floorboards creaked with that familiar protest, the scent of dust and vellum rising around me like a shroud. I carried the letter folded in my pocket, its silence as heavy as its words. In the gallery where Amelia had died, the lamp had been extinguished, but I could still see the outline of the desk, the chair slightly pushed back, the ghost of her presence lingering. I sat in her chair, letting the stillness speak. And in that silence I began to see the truth of the letter, not in what it said, but in what it lacked. There was no date, no address, no signature. For a woman as meticulous as Amelia, such omissions were not carelessness. They were strategy. This was not a letter meant to be sent. It was a record, perhaps a rehearsal of accusation, or a warning left where someone might stumble upon it too late. Lewis joined me there, his footsteps hesitant. He asked whether the letter changed anything. I told him it changed everything and nothing. It gave us a glimpse into her fear, but not the face of the one who inspired it. He looked weary, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. He said he wished she had finished the page, that she had written the name, the truth. I shook my head. Truth is rarely written so directly. It slips between the margins, half seen, half suspected. Back in my room, I poured whiskey and stared at the crossword. 10 down, incomplete communication, 7 letters. The answer unfolded without effort. Yet as I inked the word onto the page, I thought not of messages sent, but of those left deliberately unfinished, letters that tell us more by where they end than by where they begin. Amelia had written such a letter, and I feared, as the whiskey burned its slow path, that I was still reading in the dark. It was late when I returned to the college, the night air thick with the kind of silence that belongs only to cloisters. The rain had passed, leaving the flagstones slick, the arches mirrored faintly beneath my feet. One hears things at such hours. The drip of water from a gargoyle's mouth, the brush of a gown against stone, the whisper of feet that are not there. Oxford is not short of ghosts, though most of them are the living who refuse to let go. Lewis had gone home hours before. He dislikes cloisters at night, says they unsettle him. I, on the other hand, have always found them oddly companionable. They offer a solitude laced with suspicion, the kind of solitude in which one hears one's own thoughts sharpen. That evening, however, the solitude was not comforting. It pressed close, insistent, as though the walls themselves wished to remind me of what I had failed to see. The porter, half asleep in his chair, stirred when I asked if anyone had passed through. He shook his head, then added, after a pause too long to be innocent, that he had thought he saw a figure slipping beneath the arch just after midnight. A student, perhaps, though he could not swear it. He smiled nervously as though embarrassed by his own uncertainty. I thanked him, but my mind lingered on his hesitation. Memory is never neutral. It either hides too much or remembers too little. I walked the length of the cloister, each step echoing. The lamps were few, their light fractured by rain upon the leaded glass. Halfway along I stopped. A scrap of paper clung to the stone bench beneath the arcade, damp and curling. I peeled it away and smoothed it. Half a page, torn, ink smeared. A single phrase, legible lux obscura. The same words that had threaded themselves through Amelia's notes, her letter, her silence. I slipped the scrap into my pocket, though I already knew what Lewis would say. Coincidence? Again, it's always a coincidence. But the cloister carried more than scraps. At the far end, where the shadows pooled deepest, I heard the faintest cough. Not a student's careless sound, but something more cautious, half suppressed. I called out softly. The silence returned, heavy. When I reached the spot, there was nothing. Only the old oak door closed and the smell of candle, smoke lingering in the damp air. Someone had been there not long before. I returned to my rooms uneasy. The city lay dark, but my mind would not rest. I poured whiskey and unfolded the crossword. 6 across haunting presence, 5 letters. The answer wraith slid into place too easily, as though the puzzle itself were mocking me. A ghost in the cloister, a ghost in the margins of Amelia's work, a ghost in the memory of those who spoke of her with voices too rehearsed. Oxford was full of them, and I, foolishly, had allowed one to slip by in the flesh. Later, Lewis would insist I had imagined the cough. He said echoes play tricks, especially when one is tired. He was probably right, at least in part. But I have never mistaken the sound of a human throat for the settling of stone. No, there had been someone there watching, listening, perhaps even reading over my shoulder the very words I now commit to memory. The cloisters keep their secrets, and sometimes they whisper them back in fragments. A torn page, a cough in the dark, a word repeated like an incantation. Lux obscura. Light hidden, light extinguished, light perverted into something unrecognizable. I lay in bed that night, hearing the echo of my own steps on wet stone, and wondered whether the ghost I had heard was Amelia herself, or the one who had silenced her. In Oxford, the distinction is rarely clear. It is a curious affliction of mine that I distrust first answers, in crosswords, in conversation, in life. The neat reply, the one that appears to settle the matter with enviable grace, is often no answer at all. What interests me is the second solution, the one that hides beneath the surface, hesitant, untidy, but closer to the truth. Amelia's death had been wrapped neatly in explanations, each one presented with the satisfaction of men who believed the matter closed. Yet I knew better. The first solution had already been offered. It was time to look for the second. Lewis and I met in the Radcliffe Quad as dusk pulled itself across the sky. He carried the day's reports, his face pale with the weight of paper. He said the coroner's verdict would stand natural causes, the inevitable collapse of a woman worn thin by study and solitude. He spoke the words without conviction, as though testing them in the air. I asked if he believed it. He said he wanted to. I told him wanting and believing were not the same. He looked away, as if ashamed. We returned to the library, though the hour was late. The desks had been cleared, the lamps extinguished, but the smell of vellum lingered, the faint sweetness of old bindings rising from the dark. I carried Amelia's unfinished letter in my pocket, its silence pressing against me like a bruise. On her desk we placed the copy of the folio she had last touched, and for a long while we stared at it without speaking, as though waiting for the dead woman to resume her notes. Lewis broke the silence by asking whether I thought she had truly discovered anything. I replied that discovery is a dangerous word. Sometimes we discover what others prefer concealed. Sometimes we discover only our own undoing. He frowned, not satisfied, but too weary to argue. I turned the pages again, slower this time. My eyes caught what they had missed before, the faint indentation of a mark along the edge of the parchment, not ink, but pressure, as if something had been pressed against it. A ring, perhaps. The signet she wore, the one that seemed too large for her finger. I ran my hand lightly across it. The bird emblem matched the crease perfectly. She had leaned hard against this margin, writing with urgency, pressing into the text, as if the paper itself must remember her intent, but the words she wrote there were gone, torn away, perhaps deliberately. The page had been altered. Lewis asked if I was certain. I told him certainty was a luxury, what we had was suggestion, and suggestion often leads further than proof. He muttered that I made life sound like a puzzle. I said life was nothing but a puzzle, except the clues are rarely fair. Back in my room later, I set the crossword before me. 12 down, 2 answers possible, both correct. I smiled. The clue read simply, charge. 1 answer, accuse, another electrical. 2 truths, each carrying a different weight. Amelia's death had the same shape. 1 explanation, simple, tragic, convenient. The other darker, unsent, unfinished. The second solution. I thought of the cough in the cloister, the torn scrap of lux obscura, the silence of the dons who spoke too little or too much. Each piece refused to fit the first solution, but together they formed a pattern no coroner would acknowledge. It was not the neatness of closure I saw forming, but the untidiness of conspiracy. Lewis had asked me once whether I believed in ghosts. I told him no, but as the whiskey glass emptied beside me and the crossword blurred under the lamp, I wondered whether Amelia herself had left behind the second solution, scattered in fragments, waiting for someone foolish enough to gather them. A ring pressed into parchment, a word repeated in margins, a letter abandoned mid-sentence. None of them prove, but all of them exist. The first solution said she died of her own heart's failure. The second whispered she died because she knew too much, and I, listening to the whisper, could no longer ignore it. Some truths do not declare themselves in revelation. They slip instead into the margins, disguised as error. I had been taught long ago that the surest way to spot a forger was not in his invention, but in his corrections. It was with that thought that I approached Amelia's papers once more, late one evening, when the city lay in drizzle and the bells struck with more melancholy than rhythm. The reading room was empty, save for the hum of a radiator and the faint scratch of my own pen. I had asked the custodian to leave the annotated folio in my care, and he had done so reluctantly, with that air of reverence librarians reserve for their charges. I turned again to her hand, angular, urgent, the words written in haste, but never in carelessness, and there, amid the furious strokes, I saw it, a word written twice, the first version blotted, the second inserted above in smaller, sharper letters. At first glance, nothing. Scholars revise even in margins, but the original word, half concealed beneath the blot, caught my eye. Not retract, as the later version read, but return, a slip, perhaps, or perhaps not. Retract and return, 2 meanings, 2 paths, one to erase, the other to give back. And I wondered which had been closer to her intent and which had been safer to conceal. Lewis came in quietly, carrying 2 cups of lukewarm coffee. He looked exhausted, and the smell of rain clung to his coat. He asked what kept me so long. I showed him the correction. He squinted at it, unimpressed, and said it was nothing but the clumsiness of ink. He asked why it mattered, because, I told him, words matter more than bodies. They are the only things that endure. He did not argue, but his silence was not agreement. Later, as we walked the cloister, Lewis confessed that he had spoken again with the young lecturer, the one who had hinted at quarrels over manuscripts. The man had admitted more than before, though still reluctantly. Amelia had been pressing for access to a sealed collection, long withheld by the college on grounds of fragility. She believed it contained evidence of a misattribution, something that might alter reputations. When asked who opposed her most, he hesitated, then whispered a name. I shall not repeat it here. Names once spoken can never be unsaid. Suspicion is a weight that falls too easily on the wrong shoulders. Still the name lodged itself in my mind, unwelcome, insistent. The rain quickened as we left the quad. Water pooled in the uneven stones, reflecting the lamplight like fragments of broken glass. Lewis muttered that perhaps we were chasing shadows, that perhaps Amelia's death was nothing but what the coroner said it was. I told him that shadows are cast only when there is something to obstruct the light. He fell silent then, though I knew he was unconvinced. Back in my room, I poured whiskey and unfolded the crossword. 14 across amend, 7 letters. The answer was obvious, correct. I filled it in slowly, the pen pressing deeper into the paper than intended. Correct, correction. Amelia had made one, retract into return, or retract. I could not be sure which was the original, which was an afterthought, but I knew it was not meaningless. A scholar of her precision did not correct idly. The correction was the message. I sat long into the night, the city's silence, broken only by the occasional rattle of rain against the panes. Somewhere, perhaps, Amelia had tried to return what was taken, or to retract what she had once believed. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. The blot told me only that she had changed her mind, and someone had not forgiven her for it. Oxford, at its heart, thrives on corrections, footnotes, errata, revised editions. Yet some corrections, like Amelia's, are too costly to print. And so they vanish, not with fanfare, but with silence, a quiet correction erased by a louder hand. And I, left with nothing but the shadow of her words, wondered if I had begun to read her too late. The night had closed in heavy, the kind of rain that lingers rather than falls, misting stone and soaking thought. I remember standing at the chapel door, my coat damp, the smell of wax and damp hymnals seeping out into the quadrangle. The porters had lit candles with some gesture toward remembrance, though whether for Amelia or for the college itself, I could not tell. Oxford has never been good at distinguishing the dead from the living when ritual is involved. Lewis stood beside me, collar turned up, his hair plastered against his forehead. He asked whether I believed these small ceremonies changed anything. I told him they did not, but that they persisted because silence without light unnerves people. He laughed softly, without mirth, and we went inside. The chapel was sparsely filled. A few students, their faces shadowed by flickering flame, muttered psalms without conviction. A don knelt at the far end, head bowed, though whether in grief or calculation I could not say. The candles threw long shapes across the stone, shadows swaying like uncertain witnesses. I took a seat near the back, the damp of my coat leaching into the wood, and let the sound wash over me. Rain against leaded glass, voices half-hearted, the creak of old timbers straining against the years. It was not prayer I heard, but Oxford itself, always mournful, always half-honest. Afterwards we stood in the cloister, the rain dripping from the gutters. Lewis spoke of Amelia again, of how her brilliance had been admired and envied in equal measure. He wondered aloud whether envy alone could kill. I told him envy seldom acts alone. It requires opportunity, and opportunity requires silence. He frowned, as though the words unsettled him more than the rain. He asked what I meant. I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the clearer answer. In my pocket I carried the torn scrap found days before, the one scrawled with lux obscura. I took it out then, holding it beneath the failing light of the cloister lamps. Water had blurred the ink further, but the words still clung to the page like stubborn ghosts. I traced them with a finger and thought of the correction in the margins to retract, words bending under pressure, words changed to protect or to wound. It struck me then that lux obscura was not merely an idea, but perhaps a place, a title, a code, a manuscript no longer catalogued in the light, something hidden not in metaphor, but in shelves. Lewis interrupted my thought by asking whether I feared walking alone through these courts at night. He said the cloisters unnerved him, the way footsteps echoed even when one was certain of solitude. I admitted that they did unsettle me, though not for fear of ghosts. Ghosts, at least, are honest. It is the living who carry their lies too carefully. He nodded, as though he had known this answer before I gave it. We parted then, he toward his lodgings, I toward mine. The rain thickened once more, drops striking the cobbles with an uneven rhythm, like the ticking of some failing clock. In my room, I poured whiskey and unfolded the crossword. 11 across illumination, 6 letters. I considered lamps, lanterns, and candles, yet the clue's wordplay offered another possibility. Answer revealed, light as revelation, light as exposure. I filled it in, my hand slower than usual. Reveal. It seemed to echo everything Amelia had left behind and everything she had been denied. The candles burned through the night in the chapel, I was told later. Their wax pooled on the stone, hardened, then was scraped away by morning. Nothing remained but faint marks, quickly forgotten. Rain washed the rest clean. Such is remembrance here a ritual without residue, light extinguished without consequence. Yet in my mind I still see those candles swaying against the rain-dark glass, and I hear the whisper that came with them Amelia had tried to reveal, and someone had tried harder to erase. Oxford does not forgive those who insist on revealing. And I, watching the candle gutters fade, knew that the rain outside the chapel was kinder than the silence within.